Hey everyone, so sorry there's been a bit of a gap since the last video. A lot of my free time has been focused on the Docker course I'm doing for Nick Chapsas's new DomeTrain teaching platform, which I've now finished and handed over to him for review. So unless he gives me a massive list of change requests, one, I can get back into focusing on the podcast and the YouTube channel, and two, hopefully the course will be available very soon, so do keep an eye out on dometrain.com. Speaking of the podcast and the channel, and my newsletter as well, if you'd like to help me support this content and also get a few bonuses like early and extra episodes, I've just opened a Patreon and the link is in the description down below. Anyway, on to the main content. So Rider, it's awesome. Git is awesome. Put them both together and it turns out it's a pretty awesome combination. And to be honest, this video probably applies to all of the JetBrains IDEs, not just Rider. I'm assuming the Git GUI is the same across them all, I just don't know. And if you want to know more about Rider in general, check out my other video, An Introduction to JetBrains Rider Tips and Tricks, which is linked down below. I must admit, whilst I've used Rider for many years, I've always used Git either on the command line or an external GUI, mainly SmartGit. But recently I've started to try and force myself to stay in Rider when using Git, and there are actually some really nice features that make this very compelling. So let's dig in. So to demo this, I've just created a web API project and I've made a few different changes, so we've got a few different commits to look at. Now there are two main user interface bits in Rider that we'll look at. The first one is if we press Alt and 9, then we get this pane here. And if you're not a keyboard shortcut person, it's just this icon here. And all of these have like the shortcut next to it. And on the left, we've got the branches. In the center, we've got the log. And on the right, we've got details of the selected commit. So we've got the files that have changed, the commit message, and various bits and bobs. Double clicking on one of these, we can see the diff up here, which we'll look at in more detail in a bit. A really useful keyboard shortcut here is because quite often I want to do this kind of thing where I just see more of the logs and I can just move that out of the way and then move it back again. Obviously you can click and drag up here, you can do that if you like, but if you're a keyboard shortcut person, then if you go to resize, you'll see what keyboard shortcut is assigned. Now I can't remember whether I changed this myself or whether that's the default, but you can just set that if you go to settings, which is Control Alt S, then you've got key mapping. So you'll be able to find that in there and change it if it's not already set. But I find that really powerful because you can do like move this window out or something like this up and down. And that applies to say your test project or git log. There's another one, Control Shift and Apostrophe, which maximizes it. And that's a toggle. That's useful if you want to maximize it and just see this view and look around. The problem is then you won't see things like if you're looking at diffs and things, you can't see this bit. So I personally find this quite useful, being able to go up and down instead. So now let's look, how do we create a commit? So let's just make a random change. Let's go to a controller. I'm going to delete this and let's delete something further down as well. It doesn't matter at the moment that this won't compile. So keyboard shortcut again, Control Alt K. So K is quite a common shortcut for Git stuff in Rider. So in combination with the modifier keys, Control Shift and Alt, they do different things. So like Control Alt K brings up this pane. So I mentioned earlier that there was two sections. You've got this section down here, which has the log, the branches and stuff. And then you've got this bit when you do Control Alt K, or you can click up here and that brings up this. If you click on one of these, it tells you the differences. We can see here the changes. In fact, let's create another change as well so you can see two files. Let's just delete a line, doesn't really matter. Then we can see we've got two. And I can just have what I want to commit selected, but I can go more granular than that. I can go to a file and you can see that each of these changes has got this tick box here. So I can say I don't want that in the commit. Once I'm happy, you can see that's got a minus, like a hash instead of the tick. Then I can just put my commit message here. And then I can either reach for the mouse and do commit, or I can do Control Enter, which will commit it for me. And you can see down here, that's appeared down here. One really nice thing I like by doing it in Rider is because I use to-dos. So here we can see a to-do pane. And if we go to configure and edit filters, I've got one Dan. So I do Dan : then some comment if I'm writing some temporary code. So if I did, and then obviously put some temporary code in, which I don't want checked in. Maybe it's something I'm debugging something or whatever. And then I Control Alt K and I went to do my commit. It doesn't matter what it is. And then Control Enter to commit that. We can see down here, I've got a quite subtle warning saying that the commit contains a to-do. So I can review it here, but I quite like to commit often. So I'm going to be pushing my temporary comments just locally. So I don't want this warning to be in my face at this point. It's when I push it. So if I try and push, so I could do it here, and so Control Shift and K. So remember it's K again. Or I could do Control Shift K, which is what I'll do. And when I get this pop-up, it's much more in your face about this warning, and I can review that, and it takes me to this pane, and I can say, oh, I didn't mean to push that change. So that's really nice having that integration with my to-dos in Rider itself. So I'm assuming that you're already familiar with the concepts of Git, and as you'll know, when you commit, you stage the files first, stage the changes, and then you commit those staged changes. In Rider, obviously that's happening behind the scenes, but if you go to the settings, version control Git by default enable staging area is disabled. And it says that if you enable it, it will disable change list support. So what that is I can right click here and say create a new change list and temp changes, whatever you want to call it. And when I make a change now, if I just whatever, then it's appeared within changes. I could drag that across and put it in that change set. Then I might, as I'm working, so I might like just drag all temporary changes in there. So instead of doing this to-do integration thing, I could just make sure that all my temporary stuff was in a different change set or change list. So now if I do another change, I'm just deleting stuff, it doesn't matter whether it compiles. You can see that it's appeared in the normal default one. And if I do Control Alt K and whatever, you can see it's only selected the ones for my active change set. I can right click on that and say, set that as the active change list. I think I called it change set before, change list it's called. So I can set that as the active one, and that's the one that's now gone to the top. But if I do Control Alt K here, that's the one that gets selected. So I can create multiple change lists, and I can group different changes together. So if I'm working on different features and I just want to put it aside, then I can do that. I must admit I don't use this feature very often because I like to commit often and I just heavily use branches, but you have this option. So let's just clean those up. Delete change set, delete change set, delete change list. I'll try and get that name right. So we're now back to using just one change list. If I decide that I don't want a change, so I don't want this change, I can right click and say roll back or Control Alt and Z. So if I do Control Alt Z, I get this up. Again, roll back, I can click here or I can do Control Enter. So Control Enter is quite commonly a submit action. So that's gone. When I committed before, you probably noticed there was this amend. So if let's just delete something else. We've got a change. So Control Alt K, and notice when I do Control Alt K, it automatically selects those changes. So I can just type in my commit message, Control Enter, and that's done. So showing how quick that is, if I make another change, so I've made a feature or just done a bit of a feature, Control Alt K, made change, or obviously do more descriptive, Control Enter, then I can carry on working. So the workflow is really fast and not switching to another application or command line or anything. It's all keeping me in the zone, focused in Rider with my code. You've also got this history icon, so I can select a previous one if I wanted to do a very similar commit message than I'd previously done. And lastly, for committing, there's this cog here, which has a few different options. So you can turn off that to-do thing we saw, and there's a few other options. I've never had any reason to change this, so I've left it as it is. So now let's look at this bottom main pane. So I'm actually using the mouse just so that you're not seeing windows flying around without any explanation, but I would normally do that with the keyboard shortcuts I mentioned earlier. So when you start using Git in Rider, there's one setting I would change. And in this view, if you go to this settings cog, and I would make sure it says navigate log to branch head. And I think that should be the default, really. This one's the default. But what this does is let's create another branch. Let's call it blah. I don't need to check it out. Then when I click on them, then it's going to switch to that one. And I find if I'm working on a code base where there's lots of different people committing, there's different branches, feature branches and stuff, I want to be able to quickly go to a particular commit. Without that selected, it was really hard for me to find where the branch was within all the log and stuff. So this just allows me to click and go straight to that one. Along the top, there's lots of filters, and if you double click on one of the branches, so not single click goes to it, double click will basically filter by that branch. So that's useful if you're working in a feature branch and you just want to see your branch in different commits, and you can X to get rid of that. You can also do branch and select, so you can basically type in, I think it's got autocomplete. Yeah, so I can select a few and only see those ones. Or another option is you can do branch and favorites. I'll talk about favorites in a sec, but that's really useful to very quickly see the branches you're interested in. Other things in here are quite cool. I can say right click and I can say show repository at revision. So I can click on here and it shows the entire, you can see it's got the SHA here, the entire repository at that particular point in time of that commit, which is quite nice. And if I go to one of the files, we can see that it's showing that version of the file. So now we've created a temporary branch. How do we switch branches? And we saw if we double click, it would do the filter. So we right click and say check out to switch branches. We're on that branch. If I do that, that's going to change to blah. If I want to go to master, I can do that. Another option is if you're using the new UI, then you've got this drop down here. So you can quickly choose here and you can type to quickly search it. This same drop down, if you want to use a keyboard shortcut, you can do Control, Shift, and backtick, and you get this up in the center. So that's the same as this. It's just a nice shortcut, so I can quickly switch branches. You can go to a branch, and you can do like fetches, or I think that's pull. You can do rebasing and things from here. You can rename, you can delete it. So this is quite a nice UI. So that's Control, Shift, and backtick. I think when I created that blah, I right clicked and did I just right click and do new branch here? But you can anytime you can do Control Alt N and you can just my branch. So you can just create a branch very quickly. So if you're working with feature branches a lot, that's really useful. I mentioned about favorite branches actually, didn't I? So you can see there's a star next to these. And if I do that Control Shift and backtick, then we've got stars here, so I can just click here to star it. And it makes it more obvious, it brings it to the top, but also you can do that filter branch and only filter by your favorites, which is quite nice. One thing you'll notice on this drop down here, and I think on here as well. Well, on here you've got this fetch button, so you can do a fetch, but you'll also get, it might appear here, I can't remember, but definitely up here, a little, if you've got commits to push, then it's a little like diagonal up arrow. If you've got commits that have been fetched and you haven't merged them yet, then it's like a little down arrow instead. So you get this kind of indication if there's more changes or if you've got changes to push, which in fact, we can see here, if we're on master, there's a little arrow there. So if I check that out, then we can see that green arrow up here. And if I do that, no, it's against the branch here. So pushing and pulling, I mentioned before that Control Shift K does the push and it brings up this, and it's quite nice because it shows you those commits and you can double click on these and actually see the diffs in, so you can very quickly check what you're going to push. And then you can do push button or Control and Enter to actually do the push. Now you've also got force push if you do need to do a force push. You might find this is grayed out. If it is, it's probably because if you do settings, Control Alt S and go to Git, you can see protected branches here. I've taken this off. By default, you've got like main and master in this list. So that stops you from force pushing. So I just thought I'd mention that in case you got confused why that was grayed out. I mentioned before that when you do that Control Shift and backtick, you've got this fetch, or up here, or if you just want to do a fetch with the keyboard, you can do Shift Alt and K, which just does a fetch. So next up, rebasing. So I'm going to assume you know what rebasing is and interactive rebasing is. I'm just showing how to do this in Rider. In fact, let's use my blah branch. If I check that out and I do some random commit, or it doesn't really matter what it is, some change. And because that branch was an older one, it's behind master. So I can right click here and say branch master, rebase blah onto master. And that's brought up this. It's said there's conflicts, which is unfortunate and not something I wanted for the demo, but let's do merge. And we get like this 3-way merge. I'm just going to accept that because I was just making random changes. I wasn't expecting to have a merge conflict, but apply mark as resolved. Continue rebasing. Right, so I've now rebased my changes, so it's made it nice and flat. So it's super simple to do, a normal rebase. Interactive rebases are very cool. So as you know, well, hopefully you know, if you do a normal interactive rebase outside of Rider on the command line, so you do git rebase -I, you'll get your default text editor and it'll have like a list of commits you're rebasing. So you can choose whether you want to like reword, so rename the commit message. You can delete it. So if you don't want that commit, there's various things you can do. In Rider, if I wanted to do the same, so if I go back to master and work with that, and I say I want to modify, in fact, let's double click on master so we don't see blast. So I'm just going to be working with this. So you can see we're filtering by master. And I've got master here, I've got origin master here. So it means these commits haven't been pushed yet. So I'm free to rebase. Because remember, you should really, especially main or master, you shouldn't really be rebasing history that's already been pushed. It's fine for a feature branch. So I'm going to take this commit, right click and say interactively rebase from here. And that brings up this. Now this is very similar to the text file that we see when we do a rebase on the command line. It's just a list of commits. The difference being that I can click on it, I can see what was in each commit, so I can do this and review it. I can drag up and down, or I can use that up and down and move up and down here, so I can reorder them. I can just drop a commit if I don't want that commit anymore. I can select a couple and squash it, or fix up. If I squash them together, so I can do this, then it says what commit message to do. So let's just go with the default, but you can give it a join commit message, Control Enter. And then, so that's just showing that it's going to combine those two. This hasn't made any changes yet until we actually start rebasing. So if I, let's just also reword that and give it a new message. This is the combined commit. And then if we do start rebasing, then it says rebasing down here, and it's done it. So it's just combined those two commits. If we do that again, actually, and note that this pause actually says stop to edit. So if we do that, then when we rebase, it's going to stop and we can make changes. So let's just do that actually now. So you can see it's paused here, rebasing stop for editing. I can then say I wanted to make this multiple commits, for example. I can then just change this at this point in time and then continue rebasing. And then it's finished. So it's a really nice interactive rebase UI. If you just want to change a commit message, for example, you can use the usual resharper Control RR, and that'll just do the reword. Right, so I've already shown diffing, so it shows this kind of difference. If you do prefer to use an external diff tool, if you go to the settings in Tools, External Tools, I think it is. No, diff and merge. External diff tools. So if you use something like WinMerge or something, you can configure them here and set them up. What else can we show? Annotate, yes. So if I'm on this file and I want to do a git blame, so I want to see who's made a change, I can right click and say git annotate with git blame, or I can just right click on the gutter over here and say annotate with git blame. And obviously this is a new project, so there's not many things here, but if there was lots of changes over time, these would be different colors and different people. And you can see this one here is a different color. I can click on this and it goes to that commit. I can click on one of these, it goes to whatever the initial commit when that was changed. I can right click on one and say annotate previous revision, so that'll go back in time to that, and then you'll see the git blame of that previous revision, which is quite powerful. To get rid of that, you can right click and say close annotation, and then you can carry on. We're almost done now, just a few little bits and bats to show. So down here, that's a bad example, let's find one which is a diff. So if you double click on this, you get the diff. If you want to go to the original file, you can right click and say edit source. Now this uses F4, so it's the same shortcut as if you, up here, you want to see the CS proj, you can do F4 to go to source. It's the same. So here, if I do F4, it'll go to the actual file on the file system. Another one, so on this pane, we've also got console. So we can see past commands we've done. So click here, we can see the commands that rider is actually running as we run them. And this just keeps that history there. If we close that and do a command, let's just do Shift Alt and F to do a fetch. No, Shift Alt and K to do a fetch, sorry. And console's come back up again. It's kept the history, but it's just brought that pane back up again. And we can see the command it uses for the fetch. Another tip, so I showed before how you can right click and say show repository revision, so you can see stuff up here. You can also select two different commits, so control to select multiple ones. Now the diff here isn't showing the difference between the two. To see the difference between the two, you right click and say compare versions, and that shows the difference between the two up here. And again, you can click on that and you can see the difference. That's showing the changes, comparing these two different commits. Now I find this quite useful because I commit often, and if I just want to select at the start of my branch and at the end of my branch to see what changes I've made across the whole thing, or you can do the same thing here. I can say compare branches, and this gives a bit of a different view, but it's quite useful. It's commits that exist on one side but not the other, and vice versa. And then we can drill down even further here, so that's quite nice. But going back to this thing, if I select two commits and I right click and say compare revisions, let's just get rid of some of these. Then another thing you can do with this is, obviously if you click on a commit, then you see the difference between this and the previous commit. But if you prefer to see it up at the top, you can just select those two commits, right click and say compare versions. And then you're seeing the equivalent to this up here. So that is the same as that. But I sometimes just like to see it up here in the main view on here, rather than looking down here and having to resize this and looking through here. So that's just a little tip I discovered today, actually. And there's lots of little things like that, which are quite nice. So even things like squash commits here, rather than having to rebase, that's doing a rebase. It's just a nicer way of doing it. So as you can see, it's really powerful, and I'm now using this as my main Git GUI. And one thing I love about this is it keeps me in the same place. I'm in Rider all the time anyway, day to day, writing code. So I can commit without thinking about it, without being distracted going to another GUI or IDE, Alt F4ing, and I can stay in the zone. And if you have any little Rider Git tips that I haven't mentioned here, then please do comment down below, because I'd love to hear them, because I'm quite new to Git in Rider too, and I'm discovering little tips and tricks every day I use it. So I'm sure there's tons more, and I'm sure I can do a follow-on video to this with more tips and tricks. So that's it for this video. If you can help me spread the word of this channel and the podcast and the newsletter, and like and subscribe, that would be absolutely amazing. See you next time.